All right, good afternoon, people of Facebook, and welcome to our regular interview series here. For those of you that are new to the broadcast, every single week we do an interview and then a performance with a guest artist. And this week we have the pleasure of having the wonderful bassist and composer and educator Chuck Deardorf as our guest here for the interview. So Chuck, welcome. Thanks for being here.
Thank you so much for having me, Kareem.
Yeah, our pleasure, our pleasure. I'd like to start off because many musicians, if they don't already know you, but many have seen you because you're one of the consummate first call bass players here in the Northwest. And usually if there's someone coming through town that needs a bass player and they don't have one with them, you're one of the guys that gets the call.
Luckily for me, yeah.
So many musicians already know you, but many people that maybe are new to jazz or the stream aren't familiar with your work. So we're going to cover as much as we can here in the time that we have. And listeners, too, remember, we're going to talk for about 45 minutes, and then the last 15 minutes we'll open things up for questions. So if you have questions, feel free to start putting them in the comments now, and then we'll get to as many as we can with the time that we have. But can we talk about how did you get started playing music? What kind of piqued your interest and got you involved at the beginning?
Okay. So I came from a large family where it was not required, but it was highly recommended that we at least try a musical instrument when we were about, in 5th, 6th grade, get into 6th grade band, because my mother was a musician. She played trumpet in high school, and she continued to play piano throughout all her life. And she wasn't a schooled pianist, but she played standards and things out of sheet music and that sort of thing. And so I was a trombone player. That's what I picked when I was in 5th grade, and studied and took private lessons and played that pretty much through college. And I was pretty good. I couldn't improvise on the trombone. I just, couldn't quite get it in my head. And but I was a good lead player. I played classical music, played a lot of classical music, brass choirs, and all that stuff that was just really fun to play. About the same a little later, when I was about 15, like a lot of teenagers, my buddies and I decided we're going to start a band and play a rock and roll band and do that stuff.
I'm going to interrupt just for a second because I should have asked this earlier. Did you grow up in the Seattle area?
No, I grew up in southwestern Ohio, a little town about 10 miles north of Dayton. And moved to the Northwest in my senior year of high school. So
you started putting bands together before you moved to Seattle. So you're in Ohio.
Yeah, well, I was in bands, and it was great fun. I could play like 5 notes on the bass, but that's enough to go out and do a gig, right? So, well, I just had a great time, and then got more serious about it later. When I got out of high school, I decided I wanted to continue with music, and I was playing bass and trombone through college. Got through college and realized that trombone wasn't calling my name like the bass was. For one of the reasons was just being able to improvise and feel free, also having a function of being able to play all the time instead of, as a horn player, you play and then you sit, and then you play and you sit. In rhythm section,
some horn players
always playing all the time. Yeah, some people never stop, right? So for me, that was really fun because I'd always be sitting there with my horn listening to the rhythm section cooking. It's like, wow, I want to get into that. So the trombone is still in the closet. Maybe I'll do one of those old folks bands when I get older.
Well, there's a band, I can't remember, it was several years ago now, but Trombonosaurus Rex. Did you play with that group?
I did. I played bass in that, but then when they had a photo shoot, I brought my trombone down. It really messed some people up. So what's he doing with the trombone?
Well, I think also, too, if I remember correctly, I think the pianist Randy Halberstadt also played trombone to begin with.
We both call ourselves the failed trombone players.
So it's a good jumping-off instrument for it.
Well, and not a small part of the choice that I made was there was work. There was a lot of work playing. I was playing mostly electric bass at that time, and no paid work for a trombone player, especially for ones that weren't like at the top of their game. And this was back in the 70s when there was a lot of club work. It was pre-disco era, so every club, every lounge had live music. It wasn't necessarily jazz, but it was, you could make a living. You could play 5 nights a week for weeks on end in a band. And that's what I did. So that was a great education, because to me, the best education is always on the bandstand, because you find out right away what you don't know.
Very true. Well, I'm curious. So you came from a musical family. Did your parents teach you themselves, or did they try and like maybe get one of their friends who taught to give you lessons, or was it all just self-taught? How did this stuff begin?
My school in Ohio had a great band director whose name was Cool, actually. It was Dick Cool was his name, and he was. But so they always recommended that their students take private lessons, and they had a roster of people. So as a trombone player, I took lessons from a professional trumpet player. But he was great. He was really great. He didn't play trombone, but he didn't need to. He's my first lesson where I came in and I hadn't practiced, and he just kind of sat there and he went, you know, you got 2 choices. He says, you can get really good at sight reading, or you can practice. Yeah. Pick one. So I started practicing more. But.
Well, and then so you were in high school in Ohio as well,
Mm-hmm.
correct?
Yes.
Okay.
Separately, last year I moved to the Silverdale area and went to Central Kitsap. And as it turns out, the band director there was a guy named Maury Peterson, who turned me on to jazz. And I was playing trombone and bass at the time. Later, I found out that he was the father of Jennifer Ivester, Mark Ivester's wife, a great singer. Yes. Mark Ivester, a great drummer that I played with. Yes. And that was a strange connection. But Maury kind of introduced me to playing jazz, and it just kind of went, oh, wow, you can just make this stuff up as you go along. That's great. So
well, that's interesting, that time frame. I know I'm an alumni of Olympic College.
Mm-hmm.
Went there 97, 98-ish, around 99. And I know I heard, or back in maybe it was the 70s or 80s, Rufus Reed went to Olympic.
I think he did. Ago. He was in the Navy. No, not Navy. He was in the Air Force Band at McCord. And I think he took some classes up there.
So great bassists come from that area of the Northwest. That's good to know. Okay. Well, so I want to stick with Ohio just because I'm talking about your humble beginnings here. Was there much of a jazz scene or music scene in Ohio when you were growing up, or not so much?
You know, if there was, I had no clue about it. I didn't even know what jazz was when I was younger. You know, I probably, if I had heard Charlie Parker then, it just would have confused me. You know, because I wasn't ready for it. I didn't understand that music. I mostly was listening to classical music, brass band music, and rock and roll. So, but later it all kind of brought all the parts of my musicality together when I heard jazz. Like, oh, wow, I can do this. I can put this all together. And also, as a bass player, what drew me to just being a bass player is its function in the band as a kind of a fulcrum between the harmony and the rhythm. And even though it's a supportive role, it also has a lot of power, too. And I was attracted to that you could shape from the bass chair the direction that the music goes. So that was interesting for me.
Well, so then, and you said end of high school is when you started playing the bass, correct?
It's like sophomore year. Yeah.
And was it mostly acoustic, or was electric in there at the
all
forefront?
Electric. I didn't play acoustic bass till I was about 22. And I was already playing professionally in Tacoma and Seattle at that time, and was fine hitting a brick wall where I just couldn't get gigs playing jazz unless I was playing upright. And so I bought one, and that one I kind of was self-taught for a while, for a long time. I should have gotten a teacher, but it's actually come in handy as a teacher, because since I did teach myself, I know that I can show the students a lot of shortcuts that I had to kind of learn by just going along. And later, I went back and studied with Ron Simon of the Seattle Symphony, which really just kind of plugged a lot of holes in my technical stuff. So
I think it's interesting talking to a lot of bass players, maybe, and maybe a lot of students don't realize this, but a lot of great jazz players have gone back and studied, if they didn't start studying classical, but they've gone back and studied with classical masters to get the foundations and the technique. Is that a fair assumption?
yes, yeah, it's kind of where the function of the instrument is, especially if you're going to play with the bow. Which I don't do a lot, like there are great players here in town that do that really well, and I can do it as a functional level. But it's the way to really study the bass, to hear exactly what your pitch is, not an approximation. You can kind of get away with some stuff playing this way, pitch-wise, It's like, hey, it's pretty in tune. You put a bow on it, there's no doubt it's crystal clear. And there's no middle ground.
Well, I'm curious. You've played with so many master musicians over the course of your life, and been able to work in their groups and spend quite a bit of time, multiple occasions with different people, and which of course shapes who you are right now today as a musician and your musical tastes. And you had all the other wonderful classical upbringing from your family. I'm curious, when you started playing electric bass, who were some of your favorites? Everyone has their like heroes. Who were some of your heroes on electric bass? Let's start with that.
Gosh, the guy I played with Jimi Hendrix, Noel Redding, Jack Bruce, the Blood, Sweat, and Tears bassist Jim Fielder, who I'm strangely on Facebook with now, and other people like that that were kind of they were great time players, but they also had the ability to do really creative fills. And my sister always played Motown records when I was a kid, and I was always drawn to that bass playing on that. I didn't know who the heck that was. Later I found out it was James Jamerson, and that was very influential too. So I'd always try to use that kind of concept of keeping it locked down, keeping time going, and making the band feel good, but also being able to fill in certain things and play what you feel on that. So,
well, and then the flip side of the coin on acoustic, when you started going to acoustic, were you already? I'm assuming you probably already were listening to acoustic players because of your attention to jazz. But who were some of the folks that you gravitated towards?
It's interesting. Most of the students these days are starting with Ray Brown and people like that, which is wonderful. I didn't start with Ray. I had to kind of get to Ray. Actually, the person I heard the most at that time was Ron Carter. Yeah. And his early CTI records, and he was playing on everybody's records, and it's just that sound and what he played was just amazing. So him, Dave Holland was another one who was very influential. Still is. He's still going strong. And then I found who those guys listened to, and then went back to Ray, and then to PC, Paul Chambers, Red Mitchell is another guy that I listened to. There's a whole host of wonderful bass players from that era.
Once you get started, it just leads to the next and leads to the next.
And then Scott LaFaro and the Bill Evans bass players going up to Mark Johnson, and just fantastic.
I was having a discussion with one of my other guests, I can't remember who, but also in one of my classes they were talking about, who do you recommend listening to and why, and just learning this type of stuff. And I think we have all these wonderful resources now to listen to music, Spotify, and for better or worse, how they don't pay musicians. But there's all this access to music. But for me, how I learned a lot about sidemen was from reading liner notes on CDs or albums or whatever, which you don't really get that information. You have to really dig. And let's face it, most students nowadays aren't going to take the time to look that information up unless they're told and it's kind of hammered into them. They just are going to listen, and then they'll never really know. So it's hard for them to find that information.
Right.
Any thoughts about that?
Well, you can find it. There is Wikipedia, and sometimes that's actually correct. But you do your homework, because you hear certain things and you go, wow, who is that? Who's on there? And and you Google the album and look at reviews and see who it is, and then you find out who it is and where they're from, what their background is, who they listen to, and who's listened to them, and it's all a continuum, going all the way back. So, but I always make all my students just find out who's playing on this record, because that's the important part. If it's improvisational music, it's not just people filling seats in a band and playing parts. They're all contributing to that particular sound, and you've got to find out what all those individual voices are, where those came from, and how that causes that music to be made at that particular time.
And also time period too. Like some of these artists that have had decades of a career. If you've never heard John Coltrane before, and I'll use myself as an example. I had every cassette I could find of Charlie Parker, and the first time I heard John Coltrane, it was late John Coltrane. Mm-hmm. Absolutely hated it. I'm like, I don't like John Coltrane. Had I listened to early John Coltrane with Miles, it'd be like, oh, this is wonderful. So, I mean, unless you are looking for that information and you're even cognizant to do that, you may never know, or unless I had to find by accident later on,
Right, and that's one of the the great things about the internet is now you can go, oh, God, what is that? What's the deal with this person? Then, well, they actually had a career before that, Paul McCartney was in a band before Wings. Strange,
Well, okay, so you're here in the Bremerton, Silverdale area. You're gigging in Tacoma and Seattle. College, where did you go to college?
I went to college at Evergreen College in Olympia. This was in the early days of the college, and they actually had a music department. I think they have some semblance, so don't take that as an insult if you're from Evergreen. But they had a big band. They had combos. The program was run by a gentleman named Donald Chan, who's a pianist, and is still, he's a conductor of musical theater tours of the world. So he kind of ran the big band. I played in the big band as a trombone player and as a bass player. Took theory classes from him. Another fellow came in named Norman Durkee, who was a composer and a pianist in the Seattle area, and he wrote all kinds of things. He wrote commercial music, he wrote operas, he wrote he was the original composer for the Teatro Zinzanni, and a character, a true character with his capital C. But he was great because they had a studio at Evergreen. This is in the early 70s. And it was an 8-track studio, which most colleges didn't have that at the time. And that's kind of was his world. He was a studio guy. So he took me and a guitarist and a drummer into the studio once a week, and we cut tracks. And for me, that was a great education because I was able to immediately hear what I was doing, because he'd take us in the booth, and solo your part on the board, and say, here, listen to yourself. Why did you do that? What would you do that? And to me, that was like eye-opening. So I had good teachers there. At a certain point, I left because I wanted to go on the road as a player. So I did, and I did that for many years. Playing some commercial music, occasionally starting to play jazz around the Tacoma area. I was moved to Tacoma, and there's a guy named Chris Lunn who runs Victory Music, who had a place on 6th Avenue called the Victory Music Hall. So I started playing with various people. There was a great pianist and composer named Jorgen Cruz from Tacoma, who just passed away last year. And he had a group playing original, kind of more fusion type music, but very creative. And it was kind of right where my mind was at the time. And so we played that. I was playing bebop with a guy named Ray Downey, who was a saxophonist. And eventually met Denny Goodhue at one of those places too, and ended up migrating to Seattle and starting to play with Dave and Barney McClure. And
You're talking about Dave Peck?
Dave Peterson.
Oh, Dave, I'm sorry.
Yeah, sorry, Dave Peterson. And then I met Dave Peck through that, Dean Hodges, and started playing with all those people as well. But yeah, Evergreen was interesting. It was a school, to me, there were, if you didn't know what you wanted to do, you could do nothing and kind of still hang at the time. I don't think it's still like that or not. But if you knew what you wanted to do, you had the resources to kind of go and do that. And once I figured out what I wanted to do, it was a good place for a while for me. So.
Well, again, I need to apologize. The post that I put at the beginning of this, it only scratches the surface of the amount of work that you've done in your illustrious, massive career. There's a lot of recording, a lot of touring, a lot of band leading, being a sideman, education. There's tons of stuff. And if people want to learn more about that, they can contact you via your website, which is
chuckdeardorf.com.
Okay. Yeah. Because I think it mentions like maybe 5 or 6 large name artists, but there's zillions that you've worked with over the course of your career.
Yeah. I have a whole page of a bunch of the people that I've worked with. So flash forward to kind of the late 70s in Seattle. I just had started teaching at Cornish College of the Arts as an adjunct bassist. Actually took some of the students that Gary Peacock didn't want to teach because they played electric bass, so I was happy to teach them. But I started playing in a club in Pioneer Square called Parnell's. I don't know if you heard of that, but that was a great club. And myself and a bassist named Dean Johnson, another guy named Steve Allen would kind of rotate who played with the visiting artists. And that, for me, a golden era was that era up to about 1990, where jazz was kind of just coming back, and but clubs couldn't afford to bring whole bands in. They just couldn't do that economically, so they'd bring an artist, and then they put me or another bass player. Dean Hodges usually played drums on those things, and a pianist if they needed a pianist. Barney McClure, Dave Peck, Mark Seals did a lot of those, and others. But to me, that was my grad school, because I got to play when Jazz Alley was in the University District originally, around 43rd and UA. They'd bring an artist in for 2 weeks. Kenny Barron or Kenny Burrell, Joe Williams, and we'd play 5 nights a week for a week or 2 weeks. I got to play with a lot of people duo, a lot of pianists like that, Monty Alexander. Just amazing times, and because you're learning from the people that actually invented the music.
Well, I have my own memories of seeing. I mean, I've grown up watching you play with all these wonderful artists, and some of the main associations I've seen you play with Dave Peck and Dean Hodges quite a bit. I know you've had a long association with Bud Shank, and I got to see you play with him many times. And also, you've been involved with the Bud Shank Jazz Festival, now the Centrum Jazz Festival, and played with countless. George Cable's seen you play there with him many times.
Started with playing with him at the old Jazz Alley. That was when I first met him. And we continued that. It's almost 40 years later. It's amazing.
I used to, while I was at Cornish, and in fact, I should say, you were one of the instrumental people in even telling me about Cornish, and that's one of the reasons why I went there was because of you. So thank you.
You're welcome.
And that was, we were talking about this prior to the recording, the live stream starting. The faculty when I was there was just it was a gold mine of information. It was yourself, Dave Peck, Jim Knapp, Randy Halberstadt, Jovino Santos Neto, Julian Priester, Hadley Kallman, Danny Goodhue, and I made a point to get private lessons with all of you guys because there was just so much wonderful information to glean from those lessons. So thank you.
Yeah, my pleasure.
Well, so when you started teaching at Cornish, who else was on the faculty at the time?
So Jim Knapp, who looms large in my career, so thank you, Jim. Wonderful. He was a great trumpet player, although he doesn't play anymore, and one of the most amazing composers and arrangers anywhere, not just in the Northwest. But he was running the jazz program at Cornish, but he had a very unique group called the Composers and Improvisers Orchestra at the time, which was about a 14-piece group that had some horns, it had strings, it had classical percussion and jazz drums, and did original music. And I was playing in that. I got that gig through Denny Goodhue. And so I was already playing in that. And then Gary Peacock, a great, wonderful bass player, who I'd never studied with, but I studied him. And he was always very nice to me, too.
Side note, have you met his son?
No, I didn't. I maybe met him when he was this tall.
His son is a bartender, and there's a club that we used to play prior to COVID in Edmonds called 190 Sunset, I believe. And his son is the main bartender there, and he's won numerous awards for like best bartender in Washington. He can tell you the history of any drink and make the most amazing things, and you'd never know. I learned just from someone else just in passing. Oh yeah, that's Gary Peacock's son. But anyways, yeah, going on. I'm sorry.
So no, it's okay. I'll have to check that out when it lifts. So so Gary was primarily an upright player, and he didn't really like electric bass that much. So a lot of the students that were coming to school at that time were playing electric bass, and so Gary didn't want to teach them. So Jim brought me in to teach the electric bass students, which I was happy to do because I did and still do play both. And so we both taught there. I actually taught in my apartment 2 blocks down the street and used to have the students come down there. And gradually just kind of taught there. And then Gary left in about 83 when he moved to New York to become part of the Keith Jarrett Trio, Standards Trio, which is still a huge wealth of wonderful recordings to go back and listen to. After Gary passed away a few months ago, I went back and started listening to a lot of that stuff, including his records, and it's just great music. So I started teaching just the lessons there. Gradually, maybe picked up a combo if they needed a combo teacher. And then around the mid-'80s, there was an opening. Jim had left his position as being the jazz program administrator, and the current chair there, Jane Peck, who was the wife of Dave Peck, was the department chair at that time, and she asked me if I would be a department coordinator. And I was like, I guess. I've never done that. And as it turned out, I could do that. I learned how to do it. It was great. And I was teaching halftime. I was administrating halftime, and I did that for over 20 years.
So besides Gary had left. Who else besides Jim was around in that sphere of teachers at the time?
Well, Julian Priester, who I got to play with a lot and teach with a lot, is just a force of nature. He is just a wonderful guy because he has you look at his CV and it's so wide. I mean, he was playing with Muddy Waters in Chicago in the 50s. He played with Sun Ra and Duke Ellington. I mean, it's just, and Herbie Hancock's Mawandisi group, which is also one of my favorite things. And it's just, he's a walking jazz history person. He actually taught jazz history for a while.
He taught. It was funny because we had jazz history. Hadley Callman taught one semester, and then you had Julian. So it was kind of like good cop, bad cop. It was
two very different approaches, I'm sure. Yes, yeah. And then Hadley, of course, was a wonderful, vibrant soul that probably would never get a gig teaching in an academia these days. But you know what?
It's funny you say that because all of the guests that I have had on here that have talked to Hadley, and it seems like he's been a common thread through a lot of these, have always said that most of the beneficial stuff that they learned they got from Hadley. And it's as much as I can get down with political correctness to a point, but when you start losing really quality access to educators because of some of these things, that I think is
it's
damaging.
Yeah, it's just what Hadley had was he had the street version of jazz, because that's how he had come up, and he put his whole heart and soul into having you understand what the music's supposed to mean and how serious you had to be to play it. And if you did that, he was your best friend. And if he didn't do that, he let you know very quickly that that you weren't going to make it. And, you know, some people would be offended by that, and they were. Some of them ended up in my office. But in hindsight, you know, it's what the real world is like. Yeah. It is. You can't go in for an audition and just start reeling off a bunch of excuses why you can't play this excerpt from Stravinsky. Yeah. It's going to be next, right? And so he wanted to communicate that. He sometimes could have been a little more eloquent, but you know, the point is he had a passion to communicate this information because he loved the music so much. And the people, I think, got, like yourself, got that through him. And people that got to teach with him and play with him got that too. So,
well, we're getting through things here. I kind of want to jump back a little bit. When you first got on the Pacific Northwest scene and were starting to play bass, we're going back in time here.
Okay.
Who were some of the people that were on the scene that you maybe looked up to, or like, oh, I enjoyed this person's playing, or you know, people who were working on the scene that you liked, that you liked checking out?
Well, when I was still in the Tacoma area, Bill Ramsey looms very large in my career because I'm still friends with him, you know, and he's just a wonderful musician, a wonderful human being, and a very wide musician. I mean, he has the things that he loves to play, but he was very encouraging for me. Same with Chuck Stentz, who's a great tenor player, lived in Olympia, and actually gave me my first teaching job at his store in Yenny Music, which was in downtown Olympia.
Did that become Music 6000 later on? Or?
No, it was a store right in on Capitol Way in downtown Olympia, and I think later they moved it to the west side of Olympia. But Chuck and his wife Jan Stentz, who was a great jazz singer, I got to work with them as a young musician, and that was very influential. I mentioned Jorgen Cruz.
Mel Washington, by chance?
Mel used to sit in jazz jam sessions a lot, and he was a character. But he was great. There were a lot of great players. Even in the Tacoma scene, Bob Nixon was a wonderful pianist and educator. Oh gosh, there's just a long list of people.
Jabbo Ward?
Jabbo Ward, I played with Jabbo quite a bit. Got to play with him. Once I moved to Seattle, I kind of just worked with everybody, you know. Woody Woodhouse was a singer and also a drummer. But he gave him some of my first gigs when I moved to Seattle, and he was great. Just there's a whole list of people that were very influential for me. But getting to play with Dave Peck and learn his way of playing standards, which really opened me up. Dave Peterson and I were friends for years, still are, and playing a lot of original, more electric type music with him. You know, and just getting to hear the great players in Seattle and get to work with them and just see what it was like to be a professional musician. You know, how do you keep it going?
You've also had, I want to get into the stuff, there's so many things that I want to talk about, but I want to get into stuff with playing with Bud Shank, but also your association with Jovino. Can you talk about how that came about? Because you've been with his band for a long time now.
Yeah, the Jovino one is a good story because
I'm sorry, we should. It's Jovino Santos Neto, for those that don't know. Wonderful Brazilian pianist and composer.
Pianist who had been on the road for 15 years with Hermeto Pascoal's band, the great composer, performer from Brazil. And I was an administrator at Cornish in the early 90s, and Jovino had decided to move to Seattle with his family because he wanted to raise his kids somewhere other than Rio de Janeiro. And so he came by the school and talked to me, and he ended up he enrolled as a student. He wanted to work on composition. And so his first semester there, he was there as a composition student, and I brought in my great friend Michael Spiro, who's a percussionist, educator, lives in the Bay Area, and he was up doing a workshop. And after the thing, he sees Jovino, and of course he knew Jovino, and he looks at, and Spyro looks at me and says, "This guy's a student here. He should be teaching here." And then I kind of went, "Oh," and found out who Jovino really was. And so not too much longer, he was teaching there, and he's also been there a long time too. But that to me has been a great musical experience because I'm a guy from the United States, and I played jazz, and I played R&B and rock and roll and classical music, and Jovino is almost exactly the same age as me, and he grew up in Brazil, and he played rock and roll and all this stuff, but he played the jazz of Hermeto Pascoal and Brazil, which is very different. And so he put a band together, and it just clicked personally. We're still best of friends. And also just musically, it's such a wide palette that you can take things. And once you learn kind of how those rhythms work and do that, it's really just like playing jazz, because it's all about you learn the basics and then you improvise from that, you know. And the groove thing is not dissimilar from playing swing music or funk or, you know, whatever that's more of a American music. But it has a different slant to it. And if you learn, you don't try to graft that our feel onto theirs, because it doesn't work. You have to find some way to make it work together. And the great thing about Jovino is he's not interested in making like a historical, this is going to sound just like Brazilians playing like it. He wants his music to be played by people with a lot of different influences, and that we can bring what we know to that music. So
one of the interesting things, just with my encounters with Jovino as a teacher in his Latin ensemble, he's composing all the time. He's always writing music.
Yeah. It's just a continuum for him. You know, he teaches these workshops in California, and part of the thing is he writes a song a day and has his combo play it. You know, it's like, okay, today's song, I just wrote this morning, let's play it. You know, he's a fountain. And so we're still doing tunes. We're doing, you know, the tracking thing over the internet. And
isn't there an album coming out soon you guys are doing, or?
Not of that stuff, but there should be. We've got quite a few out already, just with this band and also Jovino's music with some of his Brazilian cohorts too. But that's been a great thing for the last 20, how long has that been? It's almost like 26 years now. Yeah, it's a long time.
And how long have you been teaching at Cornish?
41.
Wow.
It's my 41st year, yeah. And I'm kind of ramping down at this point and at Cornish. By my choice and others, but it's time, and I'm not done being a teacher. I still want to teach, and I'm kind of looking for some other opportunities. But I very much look forward to the time we can play again in person. So,
if someone wanted to study with you, either, I don't know, in person or remotely or whatever, they can find information about that on your website?
Yes, yeah, my email's on the website, and please go there and do that. But yeah, I'm not a theory teacher. I teach applied theory to instruments. You know, it's like here's this tune. It's like taking a look at a tune and saying. And I teach other than bass players too. I do teach.
Well, you taught me. I was one of your
taught
students.
you.
I can attest to your quality of education.
I haven't heard your bass playing recently, but
we played tunes. We talked about it.
Yeah. So you know, to me, that's music. You know. So. But yes, I'm not so good with beginners anymore, but I certainly did that a lot back in the early days. But yeah, I'd be happy to do that because I still love teaching and still love playing, of course.
I know a lot of students, and it sounds like you've already been doing, not students, I'm sorry, a lot of musicians currently have been doing a lot of remote recording for projects. It sounds like you've been active doing that as well.
Yeah, Jovino's group has been doing, we've got about 4 of them up at this point. That song that I sent to you of mine, which is just a contrafact, that's been done that way. Because that was Mark Ivester and Ben Thomas helping me out on that. So, yeah, it's not like really playing to me, but it's it's forced everybody to be a recording engineer, which is a good thing.
Well, where I'm going with this is if someone wanted to hire you to do something like that, you're doing it, and you've been doing it.
I do it.
So.
Yes, I do that. I have good microphones and have bass will travel via Zoom.
Anywhere. All right. Well, we're getting to that time. Are there any questions so far? Yes? No? Not yet. All right. Well, if you have questions for either Chuck or myself, please send them in, and we'll do our best to answer them. If not, we're just going to keep, as per usual, talking. And even if we miss the question and it's in the comments, we can get to it later after the stream is ended. So, well, can you talk a little bit about I have a couple things I want to ask about. I remember when I was studying with Dave Peck, he talked about being the house pianist or backing up a lot of people coming through town, and he had a story about Freddie Hubbard and an early morning rehearsal. Were you on that gig? Do you know this story?
Oh, let's see. There was one Freddie Hubbard. Was it at Port Townsend?
I don't recall. It involved calling in the band at like 4 a.m. and
No, that must have been a different gig. I had my own Freddie story.
Please share if it's...
Well, it's I'm still a huge Freddie Hubbard fan musically. He was having some issues, I think, by the time that I got to play with him. But it was a situation where there was a jazz festival, the Port Townsend Jazz Festival, and the rehearsal was about 4 hours before the show. And he comes into the rehearsal and he looks at all of us and says, "Well, what are we doing?" I was like, "Well, we thought you might know." So he came up with about 5 tunes to play, and then left. And then when he got to the show, he didn't play any of them. He played another 5. So yeah, so it was just like, wow. But it's those kind of last-minute gigs, which I did all the time with at Jazz Alley and Parnell's and other clubs. They're always a great education in personalities. There were some people that come in with stacks of music. Say, "Okay, we're going to do this, and I want you to do this. Da, 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 da. Rehearse it. No. Do this." And that's great. We're there to try and have their music played correctly. So, and there was another one. It might have been Zoot Sims, who I got to work a week with, who was wonderful.
I hope this is the story. This is a great story. But I
was the one where he comes in and we're at sound check, and we're all there on stage, and he's looking at us, and he looks at me. He says, "Can you play?" I said, "Yeah." "Can you play?" "Yeah." "Can you play?" "Yeah." "See you tonight." And we did.
I think this is maybe the same gig, maybe not. Dave has a bunch of these great stories too. What he was talking about, I think it was Zoot Sims, but he called up a ballad that was excruciatingly slow. And like a lot of times, when you have a slow ballad, it's in fashion to maybe double up the time for the solos. Well, when you get to the solo section, he's like, "Don't double it up," and it's like, okay, we're here,
Oh yeah. There were certain people that would let you know in no uncertain terms what you should do. And some of them is just, I think the Zoot Sims one, I forget who was playing piano, but whoever the pianist was, they were playing, just, doing this. And he leans over, and Dean Hodges is here, and he says, "The piano player is playing like he's getting paid by the note." But Joe Williams, I got to work with at Parnell's, and he was great. He had charts, but he just said, "These are road maps, play what you hear." And he conducted everything from the bandstand. He was so clear, and his cues were like perfect, just a consummate professional.
Well, there's a lot of things that I still want to ask about, but before we run out of time, I usually like to ask the artists, here you are now, as a musician, you are playing with all the experiences that you've had playing with all these masters and education for, 41 years and recording studio, consummate recording studio artist. What are some bits of information or that you feel have been very helpful for you that you would impress upon students that want to become musicians in 2020? What are some things that you think are very beneficial and helpful that people should know?
Well, there's some things that were the same things that were as important in 1980 as it was then, as it is now. I think now it's also an addition to be able to be conversant with the, doing Zoom and recording and all that stuff. That the digital world is very important because, yes, hopefully we'll get out of this, but what if the world is not going to, this stuff is not going to go away. It's going to be still more of this. So do that. Other than that, know your instrument, really know it well. Not just the stuff you like to play, but play every kind of music there is. Study with people, pick their brains. Just call them up. Say, I want to take a lesson with you. Some people would, like, if they move to another town and they say, well, I want to get in with some musicians. How do I do that? They don't know me. I always say, take a lesson from one of them. Let them know that you can play. Of course, you have to be able to play first. And then let them know that you can play. And then they'll know, right? But really know your instrument. Be ready. Be professional. Don't show up at downbeat. Show up early. Ask the questions you need to ask, but don't ask too many questions. Did Julian ever tell you that story about him and Duke Ellington?
He told a couple. We've done a couple interviews, and I don't know if it was about. I'm not sure. Maybe, but
the
go
one
ahead.
where he turned in. He felt like Duke didn't say anything to him for like 6 months. He'd been on the band for 6 months, and he hadn't said one word to him. And Julian felt like he was. Correct me, Julian, if you hear this. That. He didn't like his style because he was more of a modern player. And finally he went to him and he said, I'm going to turn in my resignation. He said, Ellington looked at him and he says, well, why? He says, well, I know you don't like my playing and it's just a matter of time before you fire me, so I just want to leave first. And he says, how do you know I don't like your playing? And he says, well, you haven't said a word to me in 6 months. I just assume you hate my playing. And he smiled at him and said, well, you're still here, aren't you? So, just be ready, do your job, do it better than the last person if you can. And be a good human being. Be nice, take your ego and stick it in your back pocket, be a team player, and be curious. Don't be satisfied with what you know. Just always be searching for the next thing that you like. Try it, You'll know soon enough if you don't like it or not, if it's not for you. But, I've seen players that just kind of close themselves off and say, well, I do this and that's all I'm going to do. That's fine. We all get to choose that as artists. But the people that I want to listen to are the ones that are still evolving. They're always searching for another way to communicate their music, to incorporate other types of things, because it's an entity all to itself as the music keeps growing and we keep growing as we go through our lives into it, right? So just keep that moving, keep curious.
All right, I have more questions. We have time. Yes. So I'm curious about going way back now, having musical family and parents that know that, because some people don't. Like my parents were not musical. I was fortunate to have good teachers and be around good people that could teach me. When you started getting into jazz, I'm assuming you did a lot of listening, as most of us do. Did you do a lot of like actual transcribing, like writing things down, or was it all by ear, or how'd you get going with that
For me, when I first got into it, I think it was mostly just by ear, because that's where it all starts anyway, right? People don't get into music so they can transcribe usually, and if they do, maybe they shouldn't. So it was mostly just what attracted my ear, right? And as I kind of grew through different phases like I said, I kind of started playing in classical and rock and roll. So to me, to get into jazz, I had to listen to people like the Malthusian Orchestra and the Headhunters and that sort of thing in the early 70s that, ooh, this has what stuff that I know, but it has all this other stuff that this other music doesn't have. And then it was an entryway for me. So, you know, people put down, you know, smooth jazz and things like that. And it's like, no. Sometimes it's just a gateway into the music for somebody else that doesn't know about that. Just don't assume that if you don't know who Charlie Parker is at age 12, you're never going to be a musician. That's, you know, that's not how it is. So it was mostly by ear, and then once I went to college, I learned how to kind of start transcribing things and writing things down and learned how music worked. You know, I mean, as a young bass player, I just kind of knew the notes that people were playing and would pick up patterns. And it was a very, electric bass especially, is a very pattern-oriented instrument. If this pattern works here, the same one works down here. So you can actually not even know what you're doing and still get through a gig.
Don't tell people that.
Yeah, actually if you have time for a bass joke. So, so this bass teacher gets a call from a mom, and she said, I want you to teach Johnny how to play the bass. He wanted some bass, but I told him he had to take lessons. So kid comes, takes a lesson, and so the whole lesson was just he's playing up and down the G string, up and down, just the G string, just up and down. So it goes away. A couple weeks go by. The teacher doesn't hear from him. So he calls the house, and the mom answers, and he says, "Oh, I'm just checking in on Johnny, make sure he's doing his bass lesson." She says, "Oh, yes, Johnny practices every day." And he says, "Well, is he still just doing up and down the G string?" She says, "Yes, that's it. He's just going up and going down on the G string." He says, "Well, that's great. Can I talk to him?" He says, "No, he's out doing a gig." I.e., you know, it doesn't take a lot to actually be able to play a gig. But.
We still have a few moments here, so if there's no questions or if any questions come in, stop me here. But I have a question I would like to ask a little bit about your association with Bud Shank over the years, and also with the Centrum, or I should say the Bud Shank Jazz Festival. When did you start working with that festival?
I started working with them in the late 70s, pre-Bud Shank, mostly through Barney McClure, a great pianist and composer, and Joe Wheeler, who was the originator of Centrum itself, up in Port Townsend. And it was a very small festival. It was about 2 or 3 days, and I came up to play the concerts on the weekend and gradually started teaching a little bit more. And then Bud came in the early 80s, I believe. He had moved up to Port Townsend from L.A., where he had enough of studio work. You know, Bud Shank, he was one of the main early 50s cool jazz alto saxophonists in L.A., and then got into the studio work when jazz kind of died off in the late 50s and the 60s, and did that for like 30 years or something like that, and then decided in his late 50s he didn't want to do that anymore. He wanted to go back and be a jazz player, so he moved to Port Townsend. Ended up running the workshop there, and so at the same time he put together a quartet that was based in Seattle with Dave Peck and Dean Hodges and myself, and we recorded several albums, and we got to tour around the world and did a jazz cruise, and he was great. You know, Bud was a very interesting player. He played from his gut. You know, he wasn't an intellectual player, although he was a very, very smart man and curious, too. He wasn't just doing what he did back in the 1950s. He tried doing Latin music, and he did a whole album of Dave Peck's music. I don't know if you ever heard that one. It's interesting. But so he was great. He was very nice to us, and kind of made the Port Townsend Jazz Workshop what it is, a week-long thing with classes during the week and ensembles, and then performances and workshops through the week, and then a big concert series at the end of the week. And so I've been very fortunate to be involved in that for, 40 odd years, which is a hard number for me to say. Still 35 in my mind. But there's a whole host of musicians that they do revolve musicians, but there's certain musicians that do come back most every year. People like George Cables, who's a great friend of mine, and Jeff Hamilton, a great drummer, another great friend, John Clayton, who now runs it. And just, it's a wonderful family reunion that we didn't get to have this year, unfortunately. Hopefully next year. But it's great because it's also created this wealth of musicians that have come through there. You went there, I believe.
Yeah.
And
well, I think part of when I first went to Centrum, it was part of a scholarship. There was a Commencement Bay Jazz Society here in Tacoma. They gave me a scholarship to go there, and part of that scholarship was to do a performance with Bill Ramsey's quintet at the Elks Club in Puyallup. And that's when I brought three of my compositions, and you were on the gig, and you're like, have you thought about applying to Cornish? And I'm like, And so you were the one that urged me to go to Cornish from there, and that's how a lot lot this started. So
you can blame me then.
I can, yes.
No,
my
you
wife
can
running the
blame
camera
me.
can too. Anyways, well, it's been a pleasure, and there's so many more questions that I would like to ask, but we're out of time here, unfortunately, so we'll have to do this again. But thank you so much for joining us.
Well,
and,
you know what? Thank you, and just want to say that I'm really proud of what you're doing here and what you've done with your career. So.
Well, all of that, as I mentioned before, is from the work of you guys and all the folks that have come before to pave the way for all of the stuff that I've been able to do and my students and other contemporaries. So it's all of your guys' hard work coming back around. So if people want to find out more about recordings or education or any musical type of stuff you're related with, it's chuckdeardorf.com, correct? All right.
Yep, and there's contact information in there, and be happy to talk to you or Zoom if you need to.
Perfect. All right. Well, we're going to take a short break here, and then we're going to get to the concert here starting at 6 o'clock sharp. So stick around. We've got some new music by Chuck and myself, and Stefan will be joining us. And hope you enjoyed the interview, and take care. Have a good one.